Hello everyone, and welcome to our third character build guide. Cherish is our new banner character and the only Guardian added into the game after 1.0. Because Guardians provide more of a defense-oriented aspect to a team, they can seem not as useful as strategists or debuffers. Today we're going to review Cherish's entire kit, tell you about his role in the Yusuke team, and how we can build him to his highest potential. Also, since he eventually comes to standard, and since Yusuke is so critical to his usability, we'll also be covering Yusuke's kit and how these characters synergize, since you kind of have to explain one to make sense of the other. If you're not interested in a Yusuke guide, no worries, since I'm not gonna start it until after this one's finished. Just to address the elephant in the room, Cherish is yet again a victim of 6-month jail, which is an aspect of Global that a lot of people naturally don't like. What this means is that Cherish will be on a limited banner and won't come to standard for 6 months until after his limited banner ends. So either you pull him on this banner or he won't appear again until around May of next year, likely right before Summer Miyu's release. This will make him scarce in the short term, but also easier to leave out of the meta if he isn't pulled very often. I try not to bring up drama or too many opinionated takes in our videos, but this character in particular is going to be a little polarizing for people. Anyway, that's the last we'll mention regarding drama with this character, so let's check out what Cherish has got going on in his kit. Cherish's moves scale off of defense, just like Yusuke's. In a lot of ways, you can think of him as a support version of Yusuke, even being the same element, ice. Now that we've had time to see his buffs, since most characters in Global have changes announced on live streams, let's take a look at his A0, which should give us a good idea of how his kit works. Cherish's A0 gives all allies 12% defense, plus a scaling amount of shield, represented by a buff called Knight's Protection. He gains 1 stack of heroism when allies with the shield buff are attacked. He can gain up to 2 heroism per turn. And at the start of Cherish's turn, he uses 4 stacks of heroism if he has that many, and he'll gain a new buff called Garden of Promises. After he gets this buff, he gives allies the first buff we mentioned, Knight's Protection. Because he's a Guardian, Cherish is a lot less confusing than someone like Mesa, the last DPS unit we described. If you can understand what his 3 A0 buffs do, that's about 70% of his kit. The most important buff of his to remember is Garden of Promises, the one that needs the stacks of heroism, because it changes the effect of his first 2 skills. But before we get into his skills, let's review his passives, because they actually received a rework, so we'll be talking about passives for a little longer than usual today. The first Cherish passive is called Flower Knight Shield, which makes Cherish's shield stronger and increases ailment resistance by 48%. His second passive, Flower Knight's Devotion, is a longer one. When allies use ailment resistance to avoid any kind of ailment, they can earn up to 3 buff stacks. For each of these stacks, the ally's damage increases by 10% for 2 turns, up to a maximum of 30% increased damage. When it hits 3 stacks, you'll also gain a crit molt damage buff of 20%. This passive is pretty wordy, but I wanted to read it out at least one time before I explain it. What you need to know is that Cherish provides significant ailment resistance, and when your team uses it, they receive pretty significant buffs in return. Cherish does need to be alive for this passive to proc, just a small note. If you want to check out his passives in the other version of the game, I'll put them on screen now. This passive is by far Cherish's biggest buff in Global. They essentially combined his passives on CN and then gave him a brand new one, so it's like he has 3 passives on Global. Anyway, we're going to move on to his skills, where there's a few more buffs waiting for us. Frost Vines is Cherish's skill 1, dealing damage to all enemies, but with higher scaling damage on the main target. This ability has a nearly 100% chance to inflict freeze on the main target as well. This move will restore 2 heroism. Now, if Cherish has the Garden of Promises buff, the main target gets an increase in damage taken, 2% for every 600 defense Cherish has, with the effect scaling up to about 10%. This damage taken increase lasts for 2 turns. If Cherish uses this skill while in Garden of Promises, the heroism he would normally gain is halved, only restoring 1. In Global, this skill received a buff, doing 1% more of enemy damage taken for every 600 defense Cherish has, capping out at a total of 19.5%. Here's a glimpse at what the old equivalent skill looked like in the other version of the game. Hoarfrost Vow is Cherish's skill 2, targeting one ally and giving them a stack of defense, plus the buff Knight's Protection we saw in Cherish's A0. After he increases their defense, he increases his own for 2 turns. When he uses this ability, he has similar properties to a taunt, increasing the target's chance of being attacked if their HP is over 60%. After using this skill, at Cherish's next turn, the ally this skill was used on gets 1 stack of Knight's Protection. This ability being used on Yusuke assists him with giving a higher chance of being attacked, so that his counter will proc. If Cherish has Garden of Promises, the shielding effect from Knight's Protection is increased by 25%. This skill was unchanged for Cherish's global launch. Winter Fortress is the third skill, and it's a multi-target version of skill 2, giving all allies a stack of defense and a set amount of shield. This part of the move is tied to Cherish's Knight's Protection buff. Allies will receive a bigger stack of defense in the form of Knight's Resolve, a buff exclusive to Cherish's skill 3 and to his highlight. Something interesting is that skill 3 gives the entire party a down gauge, meaning that if their weakness is targeted, it won't knock down that party member. As a separate effect, the party's damage bonus is increased by 1% for every 300 Finch Cherish has. This move has a ton of effects, and they all last for 2 turns. Because of how good it is, naturally it has to have a drawback, so skill 3 has a 1-turn cooldown. This move received a buff in global, moving from a roughly 20% damage boost to nearly 60% of 1. One thing worth mentioning is the down gauge he provides Yusuke. This removes the RNG from Yusuke possibly getting knocked down in his SOS. Even with Keen Eye, without Cherish, there's always a chance of him getting knocked down. If you've ever run his SOS, you know what I'm talking about. So this is a great way to make that even less likely. Before we talk about his leveling priorities for skills, let's check out his highlight. Cherish's highlight is simple, giving all allies a large stack of defense and shield in the form of the previously mentioned buff Knight's Resolve. It also decreases all allies' damage taken for 2 turns. This highlight was not buffed in global. As far as skill priority goes, it's pretty clear that Cherish's best skill is his skill 3. Cherish rotations typically use his next best move, skill 2, while we wait for skill 3 to cool down. Skill 1 doesn't see a ton of use, and his highlight doesn't have a huge need for being maxed out. Skill 3 should definitely be your first max skill, followed by skill 2. After doing those two, I really think it's up to you on his skill 1 and highlight, how far you want to level them. I can't see either of them being worth spending the Everlasting Incense on, the little roses, but if you truly want to deck out this character, go for it. Next, I want to talk about Cherish's weapons, and I don't have a ton to say. As a reminder, we always view the fully duped version of the 4-star weapon, while viewing stats of the R0 or non-duped 5-star weapon. His 4-star weapon increases the shielding of his moves and boosts the shielding even more if allies are under a certain HP amount. Considering shielding is Cherish's main skill, these buff quite a few of his moves. His 5-star, the Spina Sacramenti, I probably butchered that, is essentially just a better version of the 4-star, giving Cherish a massive defense increase and increases his shielding received by Knight's Protection. For each stack of the buff he applies, he also raises their damage dealt by 8%, stacking up to 2 times. The reason the defense aspect is significantly better here is because of its association with the buff Knight's Protection. The 4-star has more of a generic increase, while the 5-star explicitly buffs something in both of Cherish's shielding moves, while also letting you squeeze more attack in. Neither of Cherish's weapons received buffs for global. I can't really say I recommend Cherish's 5-star, but if you happen to pull it, it'll just make your Yusuke team that much better. Next, we're going to talk about Cherish's Revelations card set and how to get the most out of his stats. So, Cherish's preferred Revelations card set is Faith Peace, with Faith being his space card, increasing target defense after granting a shield, and stacking up to 3 times. Peace, the card set, increases his defense and his shielding effects on the party. This set may sound familiar if you've ever built Yuki for the Fox team. In that case, you can move that entire card set to Cherish since they want the same thing as far as substats go. If you're not familiar with this card set, you essentially want as much defense as possible. Because of how Cherish's move priority works and his scaling, he doesn't have as much interest in performing attacks. He also doesn't need much speed or any ailment accuracy. This makes him one of the only characters in the game that just wants flat defense and percent defense. We'll get into why his speed tuning is weird when we talk about Yusuke. For our next stop, let's talk about Cherish's Awarenesses. A1 makes Cherish gain 3 heroism stacks immediately, and it lowers the amount he needs to get Garden of Promises to 3, so he'll just start with it. As a bonus, it also buffs all ally pierce rate by 20%. This awareness was the same in China, they just gave a 5% pierce rate buff to A1. A2 is probably the most reworked awareness, increasing ally defense, damage dealt, and critical damage for every Knight's Protection shield. Since it can stack twice, I've added the maximum possible values on screen for you to check out. This awareness also includes Cherish's old A2, which restored a targeted ally's HP by 20% of their remaining shield once the effect of Knight's Protection ends. A3 gives additional levels to Cherish's Skill 1 and Skill 3. A4 is a buff to his highlight, and it just increases the amount of shielding received by allies. A5 gives additional levels to Skill 2 and to his highlight. And finally, Cherish's A6 modifies his buff Garden of Promises, giving him a new buff called Poise. When it's active, all allies gain 15% crit rate. This is on top of the Garden of Promises buffs, so you're not losing anything, you're just gaining flat 15% crit rate across your party. None of Cherish's awarenesses are anything crazy, but he's also going to be a standard character, so with his accessibility comes a sacrifice to the utility of his dupes. Still, his A1 is a great buff and seems to function similarly to Marion's A1. His A2 is also pretty beefy, but it's hard to recommend pulling for his dupes before he hits standard. Normally, the last thing we talk about is a character's teams, but I think we all know where this guy goes. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance you either have Yusuke or you just got him on this rerun. Now that we're nearing the Yusuke section, I'll be mentioning how he synergizes in relation to Cherish. If you're already familiar with Yusuke and how he's built, feel free to skip to the end. Otherwise, let's go check him out. Fox is a character I've alluded to a few times in our other videos, but if I could use one word to describe him, it would be weird. He's a counter-type spread DPS that uses ice moves. If that wasn't strange enough, his attack damage also scales off of his defense stat. While he has some similarities to Yui, as a character his shelf life is a lot longer because of how his in-game bosses are designed, as well as how good his skill 3 and highlight can be. Fox's A0 is one of the most straightforward of any DPS so far. When he takes damage, he has a 65% chance to counterattack with a move called Resonance. Resonance deals ice damage, equal to a high percent of his defense stat. Like usual, we'll review Fox's skills, but the counter is the foundation of his kit and something that unfortunately can make his performance a bit RNG, so let's move on to his passives. Passive 1 is called Painter's Focus, increasing damage dealt to foes each time Yusuke gets a shield. This effect stacks up to 6 times, maxing out at 45%. The Cherish rotation will slowly build this passive up over time, and because of how defense focused he is, it should never fall off. Fox's second passive, Artist's Intuition, increases Yusuke's pierce rate by 20% each time a shield is granted. This only stacks once, but both these passives reward Yusuke for having either Yuki or Cherish in his party. Skill 1 is an ice move that targets all foes, inflicting freeze on the main target for 2 turns. All 4 of Fox's moves scale off of defense, so this will be the last time I mention it in his skill descriptions. Skill 2 is a little more interesting. Skill 2 is called Bone Chilling Cold and deals damage to random enemies 5 times. If Yusuke has a shield, the damage increases by 30%, but for repeated hits on a target, the damage lowers by 60% each time. This skill factors into a reason why Fox is seen as such an RNG character, especially when it comes to Nightmare Gateway and SOS. Skill 3, Keen Eye, changes Fox's counter from Inspiration to Imagination. Whenever Imagination is active, the counter chance goes to 100%, damage increases, and all enemies are targeted instead of just the enemy who initiated the counter. If it doesn't proc before Yusuke's next turn, it will activate automatically. As a second effect of this move, Yusuke gets a shield, taunts all enemies, removes ailments, and ignores his weakness to fire, all for 2 turns. These second effects mitigate the chance of Yusuke being unable to counter because of a status effect or being knocked down, even though it does still happen sometimes. Also paired with his highlight, we'll jump into that too. Fox's highlight deals high scaling damage to all foes, but more importantly, it raises the rate of his counter to 100% for 3 turns. Fox's kit is very simple, but also pretty impressive. Skill 3 definitely stands out as his best move, but because of its cooldown, his rotation sees you following a 3-2-3-2 rotation, just like Cherish. The game doesn't give us much of a reason to use Skill 1, so our skill priority would have a big focus on Skill 3, his highlight, and Skill 2, in that order. They're kind of the sum of their parts, so I would try to level them evenly until you can max them all out. Yusuke's 4-star weapon is the Jigato, which increases his defense by 30%, and for each time Yusuke counters, his attack damage increases up to 30% at max dupe. Yusuke's 5-star is named Shadow Killer, and looks pretty sick. It increases his defense by 45% and increases counter damage. Shadow Killer also introduces a new buff. As Yusuke gains shields, he passively gains a buff called Blade Spirit. This buff increases the counter damage by 2% per stack, hitting its max at 30%. This means about halfway through a rotation, Yusuke can be doing 60% bonus counterattack damage, along with a much higher rate of defense than his other weapon. While Yusuke's 4-star weapon is just okay, I personally think Yusuke has one of the better 5-star weapons since it introduces a new buff for him, plays off of his main mechanic, and provides a pretty significant increase in damage. The extra shield buff gives you even more of a reason to run Yukimi and Cherish with him as well. Now, we're going to move on to Yusuke's Revelations cards. Yusuke has a pretty simple Revelations card main set, wanting Meditation as a space card and Opulence as his set. Meditation's effect procs when he counters, increasing his crit damage by 50%. The Opulence 4-set effect increases counter damage as well as ice damage. Like most DPS, there really isn't an argument for him having another set. This one is pretty straightforward, like I said. Like always, where we get into the weeds is with substats. Honestly, I'm probably going to spend more time justifying his substats than actually explaining what they are, because he doesn't care about attack. We won't see it anywhere on his card set. For his main stats, we'll see HP, defense, crit rate or crit mult, and defense, in that order. If you can't find a good defense card, attack mult can go well into your moon slot, but the reason defense should be stacked on is so we can focus more on crit for his substats. In short, just think of defense as where you would put attack cards on a normal DPS. If you're able to pile on the defense with his main stats, crit rate and crit mult will be your most wanted substats, mostly because of the modifier provided by his Revelations cards. Defense is never a bad substat for him, but if you see a card with a good amount of crit rate or crit mult, that's going to be your preference. Because Yusuke is weird with most things, he's also weird with speed. Yusuke actually wants to be slotted first or second. This is because of how his highlight and his skill 3 function. If he acts earlier, his buffs have additional uptime that they wouldn't otherwise, so feel free to stack the speed on for now. Obviously, it isn't an amazing stat to pull, but it also isn't a card ruiner like it is on a lot of DPS cards. Yusuke has no interest in ailment accuracy, but strangely, he also doesn't care that much about pierce rate as well. The reason for this is less because of how he works and more because of how the devs made his bosses. Pierce rate's effect is ignoring defense, so the mileage you get out of it is based around how much defense you're cutting through. Not only do Surt and Bishamonten, his Nightmare Gateway and SOS bosses, have low base defense, but Yusuke also already gets 20% pierce from his passive. Essentially, his native kit already has you covered for pierce. The devs seem to want to make him a pretty straightforward character stat-wise, but as a result, they created a character that requires a very unique build that we haven't seen in the game before. Just to recap again, because this was a lot, Yusuke uses Meditation and Opulence. For substats, his most wanted are both crits. Defense is always a good fallback, and attack mult is also something that works for him. Your lowest priority is pierce rate, since he comes with it a lot already. As far as stats to avoid, attack, and the usual suspects for DPS are the rest. Real quick, we're going to do a rundown of Yusuke's awarenesses. Like most characters, they make him better, of course, but there really isn't much to how they change his kit at all. So for A1, every 2 times Keen Eye is used, Yusuke will gain 1 imagination opportunity. This extra opportunity will deal 70% of the original damage. Yusuke's A2 increases counter damage by 35% when he's above 70% HP, which is almost all the time. A3 increases skill levels of skill 3 and his highlight by 3. A4 is an upgrade to his highlight, increasing counter damage by 30% for 3 turns after he uses his highlight. A5 increases the skill levels of skill 1 and skill 2 by 3. And for A6, as usual, this is where the crazy stuff shows up. For A6, Yusuke's counter names are changed to Vision and Emotion and Creation. Counterattacks now are 2 consecutive attacks, dealing 90% of the original attack's damage. As an extra bonus, counterattack pierce rate increases by 30%. I really don't have too much to say as far as my thoughts on Yusuke's awarenesses. I think his A1 is fine. Some of the conditionals are a little confusing to some of these as far as why they would have them. I feel like Yusuke provides pretty good value to your DPS collection at A0, so I could see someone going for these, but I think a well-built Yusuke A0 is more than enough to get the job done. Like I've said in my other videos, chasing perfection with this set isn't something super important. The main benefit comes from having the right main stats on a character always, with some substats pointed in the right direction. The nice thing here is there's a lot you can do to make this character effective, and his base kit is already pretty good. At the end of the day, it just comes down to laying on defense and giving him a bit of crit. Yusuke's teams are pretty cut and dry. Of course, with the release of Cherish, he's going to prefer having him on his team. You could double up on Guardians using Yukimi and Cherish for a double shielding team, keeping maximum defense and uptime. Of course, this team easily maxes out Yusuke's shielding requirements, even with the requirements of his 5-star weapon. The most optimal team for Yusuke is likely the Fox Cherish Cord Phoebe team. The issue with Futaba relates back to the issue of boss defense, but also because of Fox's rotation timing versus when her skill 3 is ready, it's more of an issue of the other team needing Futaba more than Fox does, if that makes sense. If you don't have Phoebe or Cherish, then the Rin Yukimi Puppet team is a great alternative as well. That's going to do it for our little double guide here, but I wanted to say thanks to everyone for 1,000 subs. I know I mention our progress a lot, but it's a huge milestone. I really didn't expect when we started making videos for this game that the community would be so welcoming, so it's one of the reasons that it keeps us going. It's a lot of fun. I also wanted to give a huge thanks to Yakaru for their Cherish footage. It saved me a ton of recording time, and it helped to get this video out earlier for you guys. So please check out their YouTube and Twitch channels linked in the description. They're really cool. Lastly, like in the video title, and as you may have seen mentioned on our community page, we're announcing a 10-pull giveaway just to celebrate the subscriber milestone. To enter, all you have to do is like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment on the community post I'm gonna make. In the description, I'll link to it. I like to try and read questions and suggestions on our videos, so making the giveaway on a community post is just a way to make the entries more uniform. We'll announce the winner on our following stream, which is tomorrow at 6 p.m. Central Time, so be sure to tune in for that. And be sure to join our Discord too. I know I mentioned that a lot as well, but it will be a lot easier to get a hold of the winner if you're in the Discord. But either way, we'll figure something out. If you enter on the community post, you're good to go. So thanks again for watching, everyone. Sorry the outro is a little messy. Thank you again to Lufel.net for all the helpful resources and carrying the community as usual. And be sure to catch our next video. Thank you.